Jasmine Crockett speaks absolutely something that not only oversight, but judiciary should look into. And I sit as the ranking member on the subcommittee for judiciary that is oversight. So this is something that me and my team are definitely going to look into. And hopefully the chairman of that subcommittee is interested in finding out what the truth is, because that is what we are really supposed to do. We are not supposed to figure out who is best friends with the president and if they are closely aligned with him. Then just Trump tried to shut Jasmine Crockett down with a cruel insult. But her reply, one question so powerful it froze the entire room. Tell me, Ivanka, is she your daughter or your wife? The year was 2025. America was not just divided, it was cracked right down the middle. Every conversation at dinner tables, every heated debate in workplaces, every headline that flashed across the screen, it all carried the same weight. People weren't just disagreeing anymore. They were choosing sides, and the gap between those sides was wider than it had ever been. And at the very center of this storm stood one man, President Donald Trump. Now, Trump wasn't just another politician. By this point, he had become something larger than life. A figure who inspired loyalty from millions, but also sparked outrage and resistance from just as many. Every word he spoke rippled across the nation like thunder. Supporters hung on to his every phrase, convinced he was the fighter they needed. Opponents braced themselves because they knew every speech carried with it a sting, an insult or a blow aimed right at them. This was not politics as usual. This was politics on the edge of a cliff. But here's the thing about power. No matter how strong, no matter how loud, no matter how forceful, it always attracts challengers. And standing tall among those challengers was a name that was becoming impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a household name at first. She didn't come from the wealthiest background or the most powerful family. She built her reputation brick by brick, through late nights, hard fights, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone silence her voice. She was sharp, passionate, and fearless. She was a lawyer, a fighter for justice, and a congresswoman who wasn't afraid to ask the uncomfortable questions. People called her bold, some called her reckless. But one thing was certain, she was not afraid of Donald Trump. And that in 2025 made her dangerous. Imagine the scene, a grand hall filled with some of the most powerful people in the country. Politicians, business leaders, media figures, all gathered together for what was supposed to be a carefully staged event, the kind of event where everyone dresses their best, where every handshake is calculated, and every camera is in the perfect spot. It was the kind of night where power was meant to be displayed, not challenged. But into that hall walked Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had already made a name for herself as a voice of resistance. The reason that those on my side of the aisle keep bringing up these cuts is because we know that we already have a hunger problem in this country. Considering the fact that we have a hunger problem in this country, it's now only been compounded by the poor policies of this administration and House Republicans as well as Senate Republicans. You see, I don't believe that you can just have a mantra where you say, "Make America healthy again," without actually doing the work. Because as the good and across from her stood President Trump, larger than life, his presence swallowing up the room. He had been in situations like this 1,000 times before. He knew how to command a crowd. He knew how to make the cameras bend to his will. He knew how to make people laugh, cheer, or shiver with just a few well-placed words. Trump was confident. Why wouldn't he be? For years, insults and attacks had been his weapons of choice, and most of the time, they worked. Opponents stumbled, fumbled, lost their cool. The audience laughed. Trump smiled. Okay, yes please, Jasmine Crockett. Recently, Jasmine Crockett. She's Jasmine. Remember what I said? Is she a relation to the late great David Crockett? I don't think so. Jasmine Crockett. Let me tell you before you even ask, she's a very low IQ person. I mean, if we ever had to pass an aptitude test, that's the one should take one because she shouldn't even be in the... So I have no idea what you're gonna... But I don't think we should waste our time. But that night, this night would be different. Because sitting just a few rows away, Jasmine Crockett was ready. And she wasn't the kind of person who stumbled when the heat rose. She wasn't the kind of person who shrank when the spotlight turned her way. In fact, she seemed to thrive on it. As the event began, You could almost feel the electricity buzzing in the air. Every eye darted between Trump and Crockett. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the two would collide. Think about that for a second. A nation on edge, a president wielding words like weapons, and a rising voice refusing to bow. What happens when two forces like that meet in the same room? The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Whispers moved through the hall as people speculated. Would Trump call her out? Would Crockett take her shot? Would the night pass without a clash? Or would this become the moment that everyone would be talking about for years to come? Trump took the stage, standing tall, his voice booming, his words rolling across the audience. And with every sentence, people held their breath, waiting for him to turn his attention to Jasmine Crockett. And when he finally did, when his eyes locked on hers, there was no mistaking it. The storm was about to break. Because in 2025, in a nation already teetering on the edge of chaos, this wasn't just a room full of powerful people. It was the stage for something much bigger, a clash between a president who had built his legacy on control and a congresswoman who had made her name by refusing to be controlled. And the question hanging in the air was simple. When Trump spoke, would Jasmine Crockett be crushed under the weight of his words, or would she do the unthinkable and turn the entire room against him? The lights were bright, the camera steady, and the air inside the hall felt almost heavy. It was one of those nights where everyone could sense something was about to happen, but no one knew exactly when. Donald Trump had the floor. He stood tall, scanning the audience with the confidence of a man who had spent years commanding the spotlight. He had done this countless times, walk into a room, take control, and leave everyone talking about him long after he was gone. His voice rolled out steady, carrying that familiar sharpness. He talked about his vision, his victories, his credit. The crowd nodded along, some clapped at the right moments. It was classic Trump owning the stage, bending the atmosphere to his will. But then his eyes shifted. They landed on Jasmine Crockett, and in that instant, the room changed. You could feel people leaning forward in their seats, bracing themselves. Everyone knew what was coming. Trump never ignored a challenge, and Jasmine Crockett was more than a challenge. She was a direct threat to the control he thrived on. And then it came the insult. With a cold, deliberate tone, Trump fired his shot. You're just a loudmouth who thrives on drama. Maybe you should worry less about politics and more about fixing your own mess. The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, the room went silent, dead silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if they too understood the weight of what had just been said. It wasn't just an insult. It was an attack carefully crafted, designed to humiliate her in front of the most powerful people in the country, and millions watching beyond those walls. Trump wasn't just throwing shade. He was staking his claim. This is my room. This is my stage. And you don't belong here. The effect was immediate. People shifted in their chairs. Some smirked, waiting for Crockett to crumble. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that the line had been crossed. And a few, just a few, turned their eyes toward Jasmine to see what she would do next. The tension was unbearable. Would she fire back in anger? Would she freeze? Would she laugh it off and let it pass? Everyone knew Trump's style. He used insults as weapons, not just to sting, but to destabilize. He thrived on making opponents lose their composure. Once they lost their footing, he had already won. And this insult wasn't random. It was aimed with precision. By calling her a loudmouth, he was trying to reduce her to nothing more than noise, stripping her of credibility in a single sentence. By telling her to fix her own mess, he was painting her as incompetent, unworthy of the stage she stood on. It was the kind of line that had broken plenty of people before. But Jasmine Crockett was not like the others. The silence stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. All eyes were on her waiting. Even Trump, though he stood firm, watched closely, almost daring her to make the wrong move. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. Instead of shrinking back, Jasmine straightened her shoulder. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She let the weight of the insult settle over the room. Let everyone feel just how heavy it was. Because when she finally spoke, she knew every ear would be tuned to her voice. But before we get to her answer, think about this. How many times in history has a single insult changed the course of an entire conversation? How many times has one cruel sentence been enough to silence opposition, to steal the air from someone's lungs, to remind the world who holds the power? That's what Trump was counting on. That his words, his sharpest weapon, would land so hard that Jasmine would never recover. But instead of crumbling under the weight of his attack, Crockett was about to turn it into something else entirely, something he never saw coming. At that moment, the stage no longer belonged just to Trump. It belonged to both of them, and the clash that was about to unfold would decide who truly controlled the room. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were seconds away from witnessing one of the most shocking turnarounds in political history, because Trump thought his insult was the knockout punch, but Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. The room was frozen. Trump's words still hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For a long, tense moment, no one dared to speak. You could almost hear hearts beating, breaths being held, minds racing, and at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett. Trump had thrown the insult like a hammer, expecting it to shatter her. He had done it before countless times with countless opponents. Usually the insult landed, the opponent stuttered, and Trump walked away with the crowd in his hands. But Jasmine Crockett was built differently. Slowly she straightened in her chair. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't let anger take control. Instead, she rose with calm, deliberate confidence, like someone who had already decided that fear had no place in her body. All eyes turned to her. The spotlight was no longer Trump's. She began softly, her voice steady, but commanding enough to carry across the hall. Personal attacks, she said, pausing so the words could sink in, are the tools of fear. They're meant to divide us, to silence us, to control us. But truth and courage, those break the chains. The hall went quiet again, but this time, it wasn't silence of shock. It was silence of attention. Everyone leaned in listening, because Crockett wasn't just answering an insult, she was rewriting the rules of the night. You could see it in Trump's face. He expected anger, maybe a stumble, maybe even tears. But what he got instead was composure, strength, a voice that rose above the insult without needing to match its cruelty. And just when the room thought she had finished, she shifted. Her tone grew sharper, her eyes locked directly onto Trump. Then came the line, "Tell me, Ivanka," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Is she your daughter, or your wife?" Gasps rippled through the hall. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. People's jaws dropped, heads snapped toward Trump. Even those who had stood firmly behind him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because this was not just a question. It was a strike at the heart of whispers and rumors he had tried to bury for years. Crockett didn't blink. She stood there unflinching, letting the words hang in the air. Trump froze. For once, the man who always had a comeback, always had a quick jab, always had a line to fire back, was silent, and the silence was deafening. The crowd couldn't believe what they had just heard. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This wasn't an offhand remark. It was deliberate, calculated, and it hit Trump in a place no insult had ever reached before. Some people clapped nervously, unsure if they should. Others exchanged looks, wide-eyed, whispering to each other. Even the cameras seemed to linger on Trump's face, desperate to capture the moment his controls started to crack. And Crockett, she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't soften her words. She had turned Trump's weapon against him, and she wasn't about to let the moment slip away. She leaned into it. "You came here to tear me down," she said firmly. "But what you've really done is reveal yourself. Because insults don't build policies. They don't fix broken systems. They don't feed families. They don't create hope. All they do is show the fear of the man throwing them." The words landed like thunder. This was no longer about Trump's insult. This was about leadership itself, about what kind of person should stand at the head of a divided nation. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was seizing the stage. Trump shifted uncomfortably. He tried to laugh. He tried to wave it off. But the power in the room was no longer his. The spotlight had moved, and no amount of bravado could pull it back. And as the camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of his expression, one truth became undeniable. The insult that was supposed to silence Jasmine Crockett had instead ignited her. The crowd felt it, the tension, the energy, the balance of power tilting before their very eyes. Trump had walked into the room expecting to dominate, to crush, to control. But now Jasmine Crockett had flipped the script in a single breathtaking exchange. And the question hung in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. If she could shake him like this in one moment, what else could she do? The hall was alive now, not with Trump's fire, but with Crockett. And as she stood there unshaken, the world began to realize the storm had only just begun. The moment Jasmine Crockett asked her question, "Tell me, Ivanka, is she your daughter or your wife?" The air inside the hall seemed to collapse in on itself. Every sound died. Every whisper stopped. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest, the kind that made time feel slower. And right there, under the glaring lights and unblinking cameras, something happened that almost nobody had ever seen before. Donald Trump froze. For years, Trump had been the master of the comeback. He always had a line ready, a joke, a counterpunch, something sharp enough to take the heat off himself and throw it right back at his opponent. He prided himself on it. That's what made him so dangerous. His ability to twist the narrative in seconds. But this time the words didn't come. You could see it in his face. The grin that usually followed his insult slipped. His eyes darted, searching, calculating. He forced a chuckle, but it rang hollow, thin, almost desperate, and the room noticed. The shift was subtle at first. A few raised eyebrows, some nervous glances. But then it grew. People who had been leaning toward Trump now leaned back. People who had been silent now turned toward Crockett. The balance of the room was changing right there in real time. And Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. She just stood calm and unshaken, letting the weight of her words linger. Then with perfect timing, she spoke again. "You see," she said, her tone steady and sharp, "insults don't solve problem. They don't fix schools. They don't put food on tables. They don't protect our freedom. They only show fear. The fear of a man who cannot lead without tearing others down." The crowd erupted, not into full applause yet, but into murmurs, nods, energy. The tide was shifting. Trump tried to cut back in. His voice, usually strong and commanding, now carried an edge of frustration. He leaned forward, hands gripping the podium, trying to regain control. He fired back with accusations, trying to paint Crockett as reckless, unfit, dangerous. His words came faster, sharper, almost tripping over each other. But here's the thing. The harder he pushed, the more obvious it became that he was rattled. The composure, the confidence, the rhythm that had always been his weapon, it was slipping through his finger. And Jasmine Crockett, she was steady as stone. She didn't match his volume. She didn't let his anger drag her into shouting. Instead, she kept her voice calm, deliberate, even surgical. Each sentence was precise, landing exactly where it needed to. At one point she said, "You can try to scare me. You can try to silence me. But what scares you most is that I won't stop telling the truth." The audience roared. This time there was no holding back. Applause broke out, echoing off the walls. And with every clap, every cheer, Trump's control slipped further away. His face flushed, his hands waved wildly. He tried to speak over the noise, to shout it down, but it only made him look smaller. The man who had built his career on commanding attention was losing it, and losing it fast. Camera lenses zoomed in, capturing every flicker of panic, every forced smile, every bead of sweat. Viewers at home weren't just hearing Crockett's words. They were seeing Trump unravel in real time. And Crockett knew it. She pressed forward, her tone sharper now, her confidence undeniable. "Leadership," she declared, "isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the steady one. It's about lifting people up, not dragging them down." Another wave of applause, louder this time, stronger. Trump slammed his hand on the podium, raising his voice to a near shout. But it was too late. The applause drowned him out. The cameras didn't follow him. They followed her, and in that moment, something crystal clear took shape. The room no longer belonged to Donald Trump. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She had seized, not by yelling, not by trading insult for insult, but by holding her ground, by showing calm in the face of chaos. And then came the breaking point. Trump, red-faced and fuming, tried one last time to claw back control. His words tumbled out in a threatening tone, warning, accusing, painting Crockett as dangerous. But no one was buying it anymore. The crowd's energy had fully turned. People who once clapped at his punchlines now clapped at hers. People who once leaned toward him now leaned away. He could feel it. He knew it. And then, in a move that stunned the entire hall, Trump snapped. He stopped mid-sentence, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the podium. He glared at Crockett, then at the crowd, and with a sharp motion, he stormed away. Gasps filled the room. The President of the United States had just walked out, defeated, humiliated, unable to regain the control he had always commanded. The cameras followed him as he exited, but the real focus remained on Crockett. She hadn't just stood her ground. She had turned the entire room against the most powerful man in the country. Trump's armor, the unshakable confidence, the control, the showmanship had cracked, and Jasmine Crockett was the one who broke it. The crowd erupted again, this time not in murmurs, but in thunderous applause. People were on their feet, and Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of it all, calm, steady, and unshaken. Trump had thought this would be his moment. Instead, it became hers, and as the sound of applause filled the hall, one truth became undeniable. The night Donald Trump thought he had silenced Jasmine Crockett was the night she found her loudest voice. The room was still shaking from what had just happened. Applause rolled through the hall like thunder, but beneath it, there was something else. An energy, a realization, a sense that everyone there had just witnessed history shift in front of their eyes. Donald Trump, the man who had dominated every room he entered for years, had stormed out. And Jasmine Crockett, she stood tall, not just as a survivor of an attack, but as the clear victor of a battle no one had expected her to win. For a moment, she said nothing. She didn't rush to speak. She let the cheers settle, let the weight of the moment hang heavy in the air. People were on their feet, some clapping wildly, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just seen. And when the room finally quieted, Jasmine leaned into the microphone. Her voice was calm, but it carried with a strength that made every person lean forward, hanging on her every word. This is not about me, she said. This is about every person in this country who has been told to stay quiet, who has been told to sit down, who has been insulted, dismissed, or silenced. Tonight you saw that intimidation fails when we refuse to bow to it. The crowd erupted again, but Jasmine lifted her hand, and the applause slowed. Her tone deepened. Understand this, she continued. Power built on fear is fragile. It may look strong, it may sound loud, but the moment truth stands tall against it, it crumbles. And that is what you just saw here tonight. The hall went silent again, not out of fear, but out of awe. Every word sank in. People weren't just listening to a speech. They were witnessing someone transform into something bigger, a voice that couldn't be ignored. And outside that hall, the echoes of her words were already spreading. Those who watched from afar would remember that night, not for the insult Trump had hurled, but for the way Jasmine Crockett turned it into fire. But inside the room, she wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her eyes sweeping across the audience. I want to ask you something, she said. When you are faced with injustice, when someone tries to strip away your dignity with insults or fear, what will you do? Will you stay quiet or will you rise? The question hung in the air like a challenge, heavy and piercing. It wasn't rhetorical, it was personal. It forced everyone listening to picture themselves in that moment, to ask themselves what courage looked like. You don't have to be standing on a stage to show courage, she went on. You don't have to have cameras in your face to speak truth. Courage is refusing to be bullied in your workplace. Courage is defending someone who can't defend themselves. Courage is standing for what is right when it's easier to stay silent. Her words struck like arrows, each one hitting its target. The audience wasn't just hearing her, they were feeling her. And then she paused slowly. She raised her head and her voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of finality. Tonight I stood my ground, not because I wanted to fight, but because this country cannot afford silence anymore. If we are to survive, if we are to grow, then every single one of us must have the courage to face fear and break it. The audience exploded, this time in a standing ovation that shook the wall. People weren't just clapping, they were shouting, cheering, stamping their feet. The hall was alive with something electric, something unstoppable. But Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bask in the applause. She stood steady, eyes forward, as though she already knew this fight wasn't over, as though she understood that this moment was only the beginning of something far larger. And maybe that was the most powerful part of all, because while Trump stormed out, his image cracked and his control slipping. Jasmine Crockett stayed. She stayed not as a politician looking for attention, but as a leader, showing people what courage looks like in real time. That night would be remembered, not just for the confrontation, not just for the insult, not just for the walkout. It would be remembered because Jasmine Crockett turned an attempt to silence her into a message that could not be ignored. And so the question she left hanging still lingers long after the applause fades, long after the cameras stopped rolling. What would you do if you were in Jasmine's place? Would you fold under pressure? Would you let insults bury your voice? Or would you stand unshaken and speak truth, no matter the cost? Because here's the reality. Most of us may never face a president in a room full of cameras, but every single one of us will face a moment where fear tries to silence, a moment where injustice stands in front of us, daring us to stay quiet. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett's example whispers in the back of our minds. Stand tall, speak truth, do not bow to fear. That is the power of her message. Not just a political victory, not just a dramatic clash, but a reminder that courage, even when it shakes, can change the world. And as the lights dimmed in that hall, and people spilled into the night with their voices still echoing, one thing was clear. This was more than just one woman versus one man. It was proof that when fear is met with courage, the truth always has the final